For our episode on political dynasties, we talked to Patricio Jojo Abinales, professor from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and author of State and Society in the Philippines. Here is our full interview.
Ako si Patricio Abinales, nickname ko Jojo. Professor ako dito sa Department of Asian Studies sa University of Hawaii, Manoa. Ang research ko ay on Mindanao political history. Nagtapos ako sa UP AB History sa 1977. Ako yung naging presidente ng Likas. Tapos nagtrabaho ako ng 10 years sa UP until accidentally naka-apply ako sa Cornell University for a PhD program. So in 1988, nagpunta akong Cornell to study under imbes na political science, tawag na government. Ang advisor ko si Benedict Anderson. Ang result ng dissertation ng PhD ko is a dissertation called State Formation in the Southern Philippine Periphery na na-publish as Making Mindanao, Cotabato and Davao in the Formation of the Philippine State ng Ateneo 2000, year 2000. Merong reprint ng unexpanded version ng libro na lumabas noong 2020. Kung saan dinagdag ko yung mga natanggal nung first book. Ang research ko ngayon ay mukhang diverse. Ang unang research kong tinatapos is the history of fraternity in the Philippines. Ibig sabihin, anong middle class violence? Ano ba ibig sabihin ng middle class violence? So marami akong research, kukuha na ako ng ilang documents from the University of Philippines Archives. Sisimulan ko to. Yung second topic ko is very interesting, is to look at the impact of pestilence on Philippine politics. So yung isang article ko na lumabas sa Philippine Studies is on daga, on rats, di ba? Ano yung function ano ng role ng daga sa transformation ng Philippine politics, Philippine history, but especially on Mindanao, that lead to the rebellions in the 70s. Ang pangatlong research ko ngayon is hopefully makatapos ko ng isang short book on the social origins of Rodrigo Duterte. Kasi sa tingin ko, maraming nagfo-focus sa actions niya as a president or sa kanyang tense relationship with the US and China, yung centralizing ng power niya. Walang very little about his social origins as mayor in Davao. So then using Duterte, hopefully meron akong masulat na Mindanao in the context of the Philippine history. So yun yung research ko ngayon, Vec.
So, ayun. So, thank you, sir. So, Rodrigo Duterte is among the many examples of national politicians who really started and gained roots sa local level. So, sir, I think nasabi ko na sa inyo once na ang primary reference na ginagamit ko kapag nagtuturo ako ng History 1 or ng CAS 1 ay ang inyong State and Society.
Maraming salamat.
So that's a very good textbook. So sa mga nakikinig, so if you want to learn about our history, so I highly recommend this textbook.
And challenge.
Yes, and in one chapter, sabi nyo, all politics is local. So ngayon, for our first question, how would you characterize local politics in the Philippines? At sa tingin nyo, how does it determine or in turn also characterize our national politics?
Okay, so may bagong minilabas si Professor Mendoza ba yun sa Ateneo on political dynasties. So ang title, ang kanyang presentation sa Business Mirror, sabi niya, hindi lang ito big political dynasties, obese na, matataba na dynasties. At ang sinite niya is yung, I think 2019 House of Representatives legislature, sabi niya, there are 163 political families in the Senate and the House of Representatives and in the office of the provincial governors. Sabi niya, 88 are in Luzon, 29 in Visayas, at 44 in Mindanao. Dagdag pa niya, 14 out of 24 senators belong to political clans. And 162 out of 304 members of the House of Representatives are political families. And 60 out of 81 governors come from political families. And 108 of the relatives of the 60s hold office from vice governor to councilor. So, at saka, in relation to this coming election, may dinidevelop kong database on who is running and sinong per province. And almost 90% musical chair. Na term limit na si Daddy, tatakbo na siyang Congress, si Mami naman papalit as mayor. Si ang eldest son ngayon, kagagraduate lang sa university, gagawin siyang vice mayor. So, tinignan ko, talagang musical chair ang nangyayari, which means in the 2019 election, walang may significant changes sa description ni Professor Mendoza na matataba na talaga yung political dynasty natin. Now, how important is this? Well, let me cite two. One is 2004 election ni President Arroyo. Kung naalala mo, ang tagal ng counting, di ba? Where did the 1 million vote come from? ARMM, the Ampatuan family, one of the most poverty-stricken regions of the world, of the Philippines, di ba? Run by this warlord family, delivered the 1 million votes na made Arroyo win with the elections. Yung second example is nakalimutan ko. Consolidation ni Cory in 1986, di ba? Paano na-consolidate ng isang very weak president yung Pilipinas? She called elections. And yung sinulat ni Professor Rizal Mujares, sabi niya, a big percentage of those who won the election sa House of Representatives come from the old and Marcos and family and the families that rose under Marcos. So that by offering that, that was one way in which the consolidate ni Mrs. Aquino yung unstable rule niya. And there are other examples pa. I think I can push it back. And political families decide the fate of elections of presidencies. May history ito. Anyway, yeah.
So, parang may pattern, sir, no? Yung halimbawa sa case, nung sinayat nyo kanina, yung 1 million votes mula sa ARMM na sinecure ng mga Ampatuan for Gloria Macapagal Arroyo in that that highly contested election. I'm sure ito ay hindi outlier, hindi ito isang special case.
No.
Talagang trabaho ng local elite na mag-deliver ng boto sa mga national politicians.
Yeah. So kaya ang vote buying nasa barangay, nasa town level. Rarely do you have a vote buying on the provincial or even the national level. Kasi hawak ng mga ward leaders po yung Now, how did we come about with this? Kasalanan ng mga Amerikano.
Ayan. So, dyan na yun, sir, yung next na question natin. So sabi natin, talagang political dynasties ang nagdo-dominate ng local politics. Mula pa noon, I think pinapakita rin nung data that you cited earlier. So I think the question would be, paano ba sila nagsimula? What are the historical roots of these dynasties?
Yung historical roots is yung orientation ng American colonial rule when they started. Okay, so around the 1900s, yung yung nature ng American political system was yung tinatawag nila a system of courts, parties, and states, which means saan mo nahahanap yung source of political power? Sa political parties, sa courts, from lower court to Supreme Court, at saka sa local states. So nung dumating ang Amerikano dito, naalala mo yung speech ni order ni McKinley, yung benevolent assimilation niya, ang focus is on the local, meaning building at the bottom. Kasi yun yung alam ng mga Kano eh. Yung mga Kano never were like the Germans or the French na kailangan isang malaking estado tapos i-establish yung power. So yun, then second is, what they encountered is not a unified, not yet unified nation, di ba? May unity may mga parts ng Pilipinas na nag-unite around Aguinaldo, the national government. Pero pagdating mo halimbawa sa Mindanao or parts of Negros and Visayas and even sa North, hindi pa consolidated, hindi pa naabot ng revolution yung, hindi pa na-convince sa revolution na sumali sila. So, and third thing is that nag-realize ng mga Amerikano na hindi mo mag-govern itong isla na ito kasi there's like 200 languages, people speaking different languages. And kasalanan mga Kastila na hindi tayo tinuruan ng Kastila. So, ang ginawa ng mga Kano is, if you remember American colonial rule, 1906 pa lang, nagtayo na sila ng Philippine Assembly, which is parang equivalent to Congress, di ba? May limitation to dahil in terms of men at saka wealth, but essentially yung election was already set up in which provinces, provincial government, yung mapacified would now would elect yung male and rich voters na would elect people into the Philippine Assembly. And yung Philippine Assembly became parang sa tingin ng Amerikano was parang a training ground for local politics, for provincial governments. Kasi ang tingin ng Amerikano, the national elite will come from the University of the Philippines. Kasi diba, if you look at the origins of the UP actually was designed to bring in the best of the brightest from all parts of the colony, diba? And train them to become mabuhay ang pag-asa ng bayan. I mean, UP is it's a very weird university. It's the only university that says, hoy, you will become leaders of the country. Ateneo doesn't have that. LaSalle doesn't have that. So, ang tingin ng mga Amerikano at least is that i-consolidate mo yung provinces by bringing these people, its representatives, into a Philippine Assembly and teach them to make laws, run budgets, but also to go back and rule their provinces. And in the meantime, kasi walang national political or colonial elite ng Pilipinas, ititrain natin itong mga smart kids sa UP. So eventually, ang ideal dream was supposed to be the national elite from UP will become yung vanguard bali ng unification ng entire colony, backed by the provincial families who were in the Philippine Assembly. So yun yung kasalanan talaga mga Kano to. So alam mo, nakita ni Manuel Quezon yung weakness nito. That he cannot, he cannot run the Commonwealth or whatever transition government unless he has complete control of the local level. Kasi ang nangyayari is, Filipinos eventually also became fast learners, thank God also for the Americans, on how to slow down government by investigations, slow development of laws, etc. Sa Philippine Assembly ito. Kasi yung mga Amerikano na pinapadala dito were also like si Frank Carpenter, halimbawa, they were machine politicians who are sa New York, yung mga local politicians who defended their turf based on vote buying, etc. Taking over when they win, take over the entire office and kick everybody out and turn the office into a source of spoils. So bali, ang nangyayari is nagkaroon ng fusion of interest. So the first attempt to break this, kasi Quezon, sinicentralize ni Quezon, giyera at namatay siya. So balik na naman in 46 sa decentralized character ng political system. So yun talaga, if you brace this back, it was in 1901 when McKinley said the focus should be on the local.
So sir, bali ang nangyari, yung local elite families And these local, which later on became the local politicians in their particular regions, parang they served as the machinery or as the main cogs in building government and state institutions during this period. So yung tanong ko, bakit hindi parang sila yung nag-substitute sa political parties eh. So bakit ganun? Bakit nang nag-develop po ay dynasties, local dynasties, instead of the Philippines having a well-developed, locally entrenched political parties? Eh, meron namang ganong attempt as early as 1902, di ba sir? May mga ginawa na silang partido political. So why didn't it take root?
Agad sa tingin ko, very, very general ang call for independence, di ba? You can be right, you can be left, you can be Muslim, Christian. Pag tawag ng independence, everybody wants the Philippines to be independent. How that comes about, doon nagkaiba. Diba? So, eventually, saan ang center of power nito? Congress, di ba? Yung Senate, yung Legislative Assembly na tinayo ng Amerikano, and expanded, and pinasa sa Pilipino in 1914, di ba? 58, biro mo yung Americans, there were what, 600 of them in high office before 1914. By 1914, there were only 58 of them. So pinasa sa Pilipino. So while alam nila ang independence, how do you run the government, di ba? How do you run a structure of a state? Wala ka pag training, wala kang College of Public Administration. Nagre-rely ka sa pamilya mo. Di ba? Of course, ang nauna among these families were the sugar families kasi naka-connect na sa global economy yung sugar, di ba? Kaya yung mga Negros elites ang nagli-lead, di ba? Which has an effect on the selection of presidents and vice presidents in the post-war period. So dahil wala yung structure na yon to parang parang i-create yung basis ng independence, except holding political office and holding like top offices like public health, education, etc. Walang mechanism on how to transform the parties especially and help serve yung building ng Estado. Ang nangyayari, personal battles, diba? Nag-aaway si Quezon sa Osmeña, palitan na sa palitan. Kung babasahin mo yung biographies nila, hindi klaro kung ano yung philosophy, political ideology nila. Ano lang yung perspektiba nila ng anong gobyerno. The first one to do that actually si Quezon. Ang si Quezon naman believed in the Philippines as unified Philippines. Yung inspiration ni Quezon was not the Americans. Inspiration niya si Stalin, di ba? At saka yung fascist sa Europe. Kasi malaking state, very strong state. In the 1930s, yun yung inspiration ng karamihan ng mga nationalists. How can you build a state like that? So, medyo kaya natakot yung Amerikano kay Quezon eh. Naging authoritarian. So, dahil wala yung training ng gano'n, walang orientation ng gano'n, in a lot of places, you end up depending on your family. Kasi unbuild the party based on that. Build your power based on that. Yung anak ng mga first generation of local elites, pinapadala pa nila sa eskwelahan, di ba? And they would take over. And dahil they grew up under the system taught to them by their parents, ina-apply pa rin nila yung system na preserve. So yung third and fourth generation, ibang klase na mo-modernize ng konti yung pagnanakaw.
Yan. So sir, nung 1907, tama ba, nabuo ang Philippine Assembly. Tapos dito, parang nabanggit niyo po kanina na dito unang nagkita-kita, kumbaga, yung mga local elites, local families, di ba? They started living in the same area, attending the same churches. Sabi niyo pa sa libro niyo, having affairs with each other's wife.
Si Ben Anderson yun. Galing kay Ben Anderson.
So parang sabi niya, they were able to create a self-conscious ruling class. At nakikita natin that this ruling class na hanggang sa ngayon ay nag-persevere, they still persist. So our next question would be, how do these elite families interact with one another and interact with the state in order to preserve themselves or in order towards self-preservation?
Well, yun nga, yung line ni Ben Anderson from Kasiki Democracy. One is to look at the socialization, di ba? Ano ba, ang problema natin sometimes ng historians, yung culture section ng isang newspaper, ina-ignore natin, di ba? Kasi center natin yung politics, economy. Pero if follow mo yung culture section, sinong nag-asawa, sinong ninong nagkasal and all that, dun mo makikita yung building of family relationships. Pangalawa, after 1914, okay, when yung certain top positions, lalo na sa legislature, tapos nag-Council of State pa si Wood, were built, kailangan mo ng alliances from the bottom to get that seat, to get appointed, etc. So one of the things you do is establish alliances at the bottom on the basis of language. Di ba? So yung anong origins ng concept ng the Ilocano vote, di ba? Or para sa tingin ko, the Visayan vote, hindi lang Mindanao vote. It's that, you know, na yung basis alliance mismo are the people that you can talk to, di ba? So Ilocos, the Ilocos block. Ang pangalawa is yung intermarriages nga sa above, which was happening kasi by the 1940s, in-encourage na ng Estado actually yung intermarriage between families at saka yung bright kids from Philippine Military Academy marrying a socialite. Okay. So the third source of unity nila is what kinds of laws are passed in Congress to preserve their power at the local level. And isang interesting thing, it's a very, very dull thing. If you ask yourself, ilang laws ang pinapasa ng Congress every year? And how many of them are about building towns and renaming streets? So anong basis nito? Bakit this Congress doesn't think about big things? It talks more, it's very much concerned about, well, we should rename this town from Osamis to Osami City, you know. It's because of that, because of the kind of alliances, long-term alliances, di ba? Ano ba, nag-set up ko ng bagong city, kahit 4-class city yan, tumataas ang budget niyan. Di ba? Iba na yung revenues nito that it can raise, but also revenues coming from the national government, lumalaki. And therefore, it becomes the foundation of, say, a rising family na, okay, ito to. So in a certain way, the practice of governance inherits, complement with social interaction, okay, sexual interaction, na observed ni Ben Anderson. And natuloy ito. And in fact, even if families were fighting, you know, they would fight with each other. Sabi nga ng isang kaibigan ko, they will be coming from different political parties. Ano ba, Aquinos, Cuancos, di ba? Nag-aaway yan. Di ba? Pero ang sabi niya, well, they fight, but every Sunday, they come to family dinner and talk about their children. So, paminsan, there are families na siniseparate yung political away nila or the political conflict nila because in the long term, importante yung family interest. And the family matron, the grandmother, puts them together. Yun daw ang chismis about the Aquinos and the Cuancos. Bakit sila never nag-clash? Sabi ng kaibigan ko, it's that. They go to family dinner every Sunday and talk about their children. So isa yon. So they consolidate within, they intermarry with each other, but also set up certain regulations in Congress that enables them to parang institutionally solidify their base in the provinces. From towns to naming of streets. May significance yung renaming of streets. I-rename mo yung isang street from a small street into a road, tataas budget mo dyan, di ba? You can now say, we need pavement to pave this road. Semento naman, so yeah. So ganun ka, from those petty things to, political alliances based on an issue. Yun yung basis ng preservation ng elite natin.
Parang magandang example, sir, yung ano, no, yung mga Marcos sa mga Araneta.
Yung Araneta's the old elite, di ba?
Yeah.
The Rojas Araneta. Halimbawa, si Mar Rojas is a cousin of, the husband of Jaime Marcos, di ba? And the wife of Bongbong.
Bongbong Marcos.
Araneta yan eh.
Yeah, so magkaiba sila ng political parties, pero
tito-tita, di ba?
Yeah.
Kung may family reunion, makikita yon. But the other thing is yung Marcos are also so different. Kasi by 1946, may new elite na nag-emerge. Yung mga former guerrillas, okay? At yung mga graduates ng UP. Nag-graduates ng UP who eventually went back to their provinces or who came from their provinces and used the UP education to strengthen their control in the provinces. Di ba? Marcos UP, di ba? Karamihan ng mga itong mga elites na to who were trained in the late colonial period, UP graduates, they were supposed to be the national elite sa tingin ng Amerikano. Pero because ito na yung habit of governance, local base, nag-graduate sila sa UP tapos bumabalik, di ba? At credentials nila ngayon is UP graduate, I have talent as a lawyer, blah, blah, blah. Mas iba na ako nalandasan na small governor lang. Tapos after World War II, at na-observe ito ni na Alfred McCoy na nag-aaral ng yung anarchy of families, one thing that bound them together is they had arms. Yung former guerrillas, may armas sila. Therefore, okay, they can now, yung mga, sa Ilocos, o sa Danao, sa Lanao actually, could now use their arms to assert their power. Wala ito sa old elite. And so yun yung second elite generation of elites in 1946. May third generation of local elites, yung Marcos elites, who is now, that elite is now ruling our country. Yeah.
So may 3 generations na at mukhang nadagdagan pa kasi may mga new breed ng political dynasties. At nabanggit natin sir kanina yung musical chair ng mga pamilyang ito. And actually in our recent study that we did sa isa kong grupo, mukhang pati party list, sir, ay pinapasok na ng political dynasty. Na parang in our study, parang almost half ng mga tumatakbong party list this election ay dynastic.
Yeah.
So ginagawa din nilang parang sandbox ang party list to expand dynasties.
Yeah. And you can trace it back to 1986. Yung constitutional, yung 1987 constitution ni Cory, di ba? It was yung party list, meron sila may honorable yung nila intention, di ba? Yung party list will come from the underprivileged marginalized sector. Okay. And the other will come from the middle class, family or individual representative. Ang assumption noon is the progressive sector, the organization of the marginalized will remain organized. Nagkagulo yung Communist Party, okay? Nag-split yung mga Cory coalitions, na-absorb yung ilang progressive politicians sa traditional parties. Walang naalabas na hindi na-sustain yung unified left flank ni Cory. If weekend ka, anong gagawin sa local level? Sa national lang ito. You're talking party list national. Pagdating sa local pa, malaking problema, di ba? Wala ka ng tao. Di ba? Iba yung fighting the dictatorship to rebuilding, building and governing, di ba? So walang skills ang popular sector noon. So this noble idea of making sure na the marginalized and the poor can be represented in a deliberative body na Congress, nawala because of that. The irony of it all, yeah.
So I think they also intended to use party list to supposedly strengthen the political parties, diba? Later on mag-evolve sila. Kaya lang it never happened.
Yeah, it never happened kasi they're split. Tapos unlimited resources mo, di ba? I mean, iba yung political party list organizations sa a traditional party na may network na of patronage, di ba?
That's right.
So dating lang sa pera, talo ka na. And money buys, di ba? So meron ka ng network. Ang political ang party list organization like, Anak Bayan and all that is based on programs, di ba? You convince people not on money but on programs. Pahirapan yun. Itong sa barangay, yung sa traditional party, okay, bumoto ka lang dito, ito 3,000. Tapos you can forget it. We'll talk again next election. Yun lang ang basis mo, di ba? Yun ang challenge halimbawa ngayon between BBM and Lenny, di ba? Na may prinsipyo yung isa, tapos may pera yung isa.
So sir, I think now what we can see is the continuous expansion of dynastic politics. Tapos meron ding mga bagong mga political dynasties na nag-emerge, new blood of dynasties. And in other words, nandyan pa rin siya hanggang ngayon. And right now we are at the peak of the election fever here in the Philippines. We can see local politicians endorsing this candidate and that. So masasabi natin na meron pa rin talagang impluwensya na nananatili at patuloy na lumalakas yung influence ng political dynasties in our national politics. So at this point, I think we can proceed to the last question of this interview.
Before that, before last question, meron ako I look at the statistics of electoral violence. Yun yung evidence, di ba, na unstable ang system. In 1998, there were 269 cases of election-related violence. In 2019, there were only 43. In 2018, there were 8. Ano significant ito? It means the very stable, very consolidated, at very confident sa role of power nila yung mga political dynasties. So in fact, the Philippines has a stable political system run by families. Kasi hindi na you don't need to kill each other na eh. Kung may problema kayo, magtayo ka ng bagong probinsya, di ba? Di ba? Okay, nag-away yung mga yung mga political families sa Zamboanga, naggawa ng Pambuanga Sibugay, di ba? Yung Davao, nagsimula ng Davao, tapos yung South, tapos nag-rebelde yung mga Southern Davao na galing Cebu, Davao del Sur. So that's one way in which they resolve each other. But also, kasi yung PDAF, everybody happy. Di ba? Yung PDAF, di ba? Hindi na kailangan mag-away over control of budget. Kasi nakaano na yung PDAF. So you have actually a growing political dynasty. The Philippines is a political dynasty, a system of political dynasties where the elites are so comfortable in running it. So an evidence of that is the decline in electoral violence. Yeah, sorry. I have to insert that, Vic. Kasi important, sa tingin ko importante eh.
So mukhang talagang they've already managed to build a system around themselves, no? Sa Philippine politics. So ngayon sir, papalapit na ang election. In a few weeks or so, humaharap tayo sa isang regime change. For our last question, what do you think should Filipino voters keep in mind when it comes to political dynasties running this election or supporting or sponsoring candidates this election? Ano kaya yung kailangan nilang laging i-remember? I mean, on how this affects our democracy, our government.
Mahirap sagutin yan kasi every probinsya, di ba? Yung every political clan naman varies, di ba? Kung tingnan mo yung political sa Cebu, mga Osmeñas, they value elections, di ba? Tingnan mo yung mga Pasig, for example, Pasig. No? So there are parts of the country na you have good political families, di ba? But there are parts also of the countries where like the Ampatuan, di ba? Ampatuans are back, di ba? Nahuli yung tatlo, yung tatay at dalawang anak. Yung family pa rin controls that part of Maguindanao. Yun ang challenge ngayon. Kasi wala tayong kapalit. Di ba? Walang kapalit. So the hope for, I think, is kung wala kang alternative sa probinsya, sa region mo, you choose the lesser of all evils, di ba? And usually the grandchild who runs can talk, magte-text sila, alam ano ba yung Lanao, yung governor, yung congressman ng Lanao, yung Apo de Mapuro, he talks like an NGO activist. Meron pa siyang stakeholders. Diba? So baka yun yung source. The other thing is to do that, pero I think sa tingin ko, Beck, is to now really think in the long term, which is how do you establish a separate source of power at the local level, barangay, city, town, etc. And ngayon, because of another ruling, another law ni Cory, which yung allocation, tax allocations, we're 40% now of national tax-collected return to the government. Pati down sa barangay, may competition. So I think ang dilemma natin is that kung if you want democracy, ang dilemma is a lot of people observing the Philippines look at the Philippines only in Manila and national terms. But in fact, whatever happens in Manila is dependent on and even influenced by what happens in the provinces. And ang problema natin as academics is that kukunti lang ang studies of provinces. Di ba? I mean, there's not no study in Maguindanao. And so, kung mag-organize ka sa Maguindanao, sasabihin mo sa anong babasahin namin dahil wala yung mga studies na yon, hindi mo alam paano ituro, di ba? Ewan ko, kwentuhan na lang tayo, di ba? So yun sa tingin ko, this is a period of retreat, which also is a period na allows us to reflect. So ito yung kalaban natin, intindihin natin anong weaknesses nito. Diba? And one interesting weakness is the courts. The courts usually can be composed of justices na appointed by cronies and political families, pero occasionally merong independent judge na sumisingit. Like think of Miriam Defensor Santiago. Diba? So maybe one way of exploring certain aspects of the state na kung saan magkaka-open ka ng espasyo to reassert democratic rights. And it's more difficult now kasi yung generation na ito, iba yung notion ng democracy, di ba? Which is another topic. So yun ang ang hirap ng tanong mo. kasi in the light of the high popularity ni BBM, in the light of the parang musical chair sa local level, yung honest democrat ka, ano magagawa mo, di ba? Ang sagot ko is try to take advantage of whatever opening provided. And think of this as a long-term war. It cannot be decided in 2019. Diba? So yun ang sagot ko. Sagot na hindi sagot. Sorry.
So we're in it for the long haul, sir, beyond election.
I think so. Kasi yung political families also are in the long haul, di ba? Everybody forget na yung consolidation nila can go back as far as 1972. Diba? 86. 46 pa nga yung iba. So if the reactionary classes, kumbaga, look at the control of power in the long haul, dapat Democrats also should think that way. And meron namang periods of reforms, di ba? Magsaysay, Cory, even Ramos was a period of reform. So may instances na ganon na I'm hopeful na makaka-recover pa rin tayo, yung democratic system natin.
So start local, occupy all available democratic spaces.
Whatever, and institutions.
Yes, and remember, it's a marathon, not a race.
No, yeah, it's a long drawn marathon. It's not a race.
All right. So yun lang, sir. So thank you very much for this interview.
Oh, salamat naman.
Baka may gusto kayong i-promote, sir, sa ating listeners. Baka meron kayong libro or lecture or
Interestingly, yung Ateneo University Press will be coming with a Mindanao reader. Si Joel Canuday sa Sociology Department ng Ateneo is editing it. Isa yon. Merong mayroon kami at saka yung isang kaibigan ko who wrote, si Lea Castañeda, who wrote on American law. Meron kaming piniprepare na Marcos Anthology na consisting of writings by journalists like Marites Vito, Crisel Dayaves, academics like si Vince, si Sheila Coronel, si Tama Kena, sino pa ba? Ako. So it's an anthology consisting of the different writings on Marcos. So you can use the book as an anthology, textbook, or you can pick them up. So ang styles are completely different. Yung journalist, iba yung style nila. Yung academics, iba nila. It also includes yung isang article ni Carol on Dovey Beams. So it's political history, but also cultural. Be something on the church, be something on yung how the Marcoses, promote themselves culturally, at saka si Dovey Beams. So hopefully malabas namin ito before September 1975.
We would like to thank Jojo for generously lending us his expertise and guesting in this episode of Hindi na Bago Yan. Watch out for a new episode every Saturday. For updates on the show, like, subscribe, or follow our social media pages. That's it for now. Have a good day.